The world watched a small landlocked nation do the unthinkable. What once looked like defiance became a mirror, exposing global dependence and hypocrisy. Under Ibrahim Traoré, could Burkina Faso's quiet revolution force Africa to rewrite its future? What unfolded next shook more than just borders. You are about to hear what most headlines never dare to say. Behind the speeches and applause lies a pattern that shapes who truly controls a nation's freedom and who only pretends to. By the end of this story, you will see how one man's refusal to obey changed the rules for an entire continent. You will understand the real cost of saying no to the world's most powerful countries. You will also see why Ibrahim Traoré's path, though dangerous, may become Africa's turning point. This is not information for casual listeners. Because if you stop here, you will keep believing that aid equals progress, that loans mean help, that control can come disguised as friendship. You will keep reading the same headlines written from the same capitals, repeating the same myths about Africa's weakness. You will keep thinking that courage is noise, not silence. But once you see what really happened in Burkina Faso, you will never look at independence the same way again. What seemed like a symbolic refusal turned out to be a seismic decision. When Ibrahim Traoré declined an invitation to Donald Trump's inauguration, it was not about diplomacy or disrespect, it was about drawing a line no one else dared to draw. Within weeks, that small gesture revealed the fracture between Africa's public smiles and its private exhaustion. One number makes the shock tangible. Burkina Faso's GDP grew from roughly 18 billion USD to 22 billion USD in only 2 years. That growth did not come from aid or debt, it came from dismantling habits older than the leader himself. It began with a quiet realization. The continent had been exporting strength and importing weakness. For decades, foreign militaries protected the Sahel while people felt less safe. French troops stayed, journalists reported through Paris, and local voices were edited out. Then Traoré listened, not to embassies, but to farmers, soldiers, and market vendors who said, "We feel occupied, not defended." When he ordered the withdrawal of the French forces and expelled their state-backed media, panic spread through ministries and boardrooms. But in the streets, people celebrated. They waved homemade flags and called it the Second Liberation. That phrase sounded naive to some analysts until the numbers started moving. Inflation slowed, domestic production rose, and small factories reopened. Farmers who once sold raw cotton abroad began to process it locally. Civil servants, whose salaries had been stagnant for years, received an unexpected 50% raise, a visible promise that sacrifice would not flow only downward. The escalation was not smooth. Regional alliances trembled. Neighboring governments whispered warnings. Yet inside the country, a new psychology was taking root, pride replacing dependency. From a simple refusal, a movement was born. It no longer asked whether Burkina Faso could survive alone. It asked whether Africa could afford to keep pretending otherwise. Every movement needs a figure who translates conviction into clarity. In Burkina Faso, that figure is still Ibrahim Traoré. His voice is measured, rarely theatrical, yet when he speaks, even silence seems to wait. To many, he is not just a president, but a signal, proof that discipline and defiance can coexist without collapsing into chaos. Early in his rule, he made a choice that revealed more than speeches ever could. He rejected the full presidential salary, insisting on receiving only the pay of a military captain. Ministers saw luxury shrink. Civil servants saw their wages rise by half. In a region where power usually fattens privilege, the inversion was stunning. A young teacher in Ouagadougou described it simply, "For once, honesty pays." That reversal had ripple effects. Bureaucrats worked longer hours, not because they feared punishment, but because they felt seen. Local aid that had paralyzed small businesses was repaid. Trust, an invisible currency long devalued, began to circulate again. Traoré's closest observers noticed another pattern. He led by subtraction. Fewer privileges, fewer excuses, fewer middlemen. The result was paradoxical. Less comfort, more stability. Then came a moment that defined his relationship with ordinary citizens. When he asked every worker to donate a small percentage of their salary to a national defense fund, people expected resistance. Instead, contributions poured in. The act turned the abstract idea of patriotism into something tangible: shared risk, shared responsibility. From that point, the line between government and citizen blurred. Power no longer looked distant, it felt collective. And from that realization, the story began to accelerate, because dignity, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. It started quietly. A single decision, a small defiance. Then the world blinked and everything moved. Phase 1. The trigger. The invitation came first, an offer to attend Donald Trump's inauguration. Ibrahim Traoré declined. The rumors spread before the explanation did. For foreign observers, it was arrogance. For Africans, it was relief. Something had finally broken the ritual of obedience. Within days, Paris summoned its envoys and Washington requested clarifications. None came. Next came the expulsion of French troops. A convoy left Ouagadougou under heavy guard, its flags lowered. Crowds watched in stunned silence until one man began to clap. The applause spread like fire. Then the cheering started. What felt impossible a month earlier had become visible truth. The era of dependency had cracked. Phase 2. The climax. Factories reopened. Cotton and tomatoes, once exported raw, were processed locally for the first time. Gold refineries switched from foreign to domestic control. Local companies paid again because the government cleared long-standing debts. Civil servants, once forgotten, saw salaries rise. Ministers saw theirs fall. The people noticed, and they remembered. Traoré's policy rhythm was brutal in its simplicity. Remove what doesn't serve, reward what does. Every week brought a new reversal. Colonial wigs disappeared from courts. Traditional Burkinabe dress replaced them. In the countryside, tractors arrived. Farmers received seeds, tools, motor pumps, symbols of labor and ownership. He told them, "Stop begging, start producing." The phrase echoed across provinces, like a command and a prayer at once. The climax was not just economic, it was psychological. For the first time in the decades, the average citizen felt part of the state rather than ruled by it. Rumors of coups flickered and died because soldiers no longer saw reason to betray. Phase 3. The aftershock. The backlash came quickly. Foreign media labeled Traoré a populist. Regional blocs whispered sanctions. Loans vanished overnight. Yet on the ground, something else was rising. Confidence. Markets adjusted. Food prices stabilized. Investors paused but did not flee. And in villages, parents sent their children to school wearing new uniforms, bought with steady wages. Outside the borders, other leaders watched carefully. In Niger, in Mali, in Guinea, murmurs grew louder. Could we do the same? The question became contagion. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the government began paying local debt in full. A quiet, almost boring action that changed everything. For the first time in years, small contractors were solvent. The economy, once fragile, started to breathe. When historians trace this moment, they may not mark it by battles or elections, but by a series of deliberate refusals. Refusing comfort, refusing control, refusing to bow. Each act small alone, together revolutionary. Burkina Faso had shifted from dependency to defiance, and the world, still adjusting its lenses, could not yet decide whether to admire or fear it. Change can be debated endlessly, but numbers don't argue. They only reveal what talk tries to hide. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the data coming from Burkina Faso told a story the headlines rarely printed. A story of slow, grounded recovery, born from self-belief rather than foreign blessing. The first sign came through the economy's pulse. In 2 years, GDP rose from about 18 billion USD to roughly 22 billion USD, an increase of more than 20%. That rise was not fueled by outside credit lines or emergency aid. It grew from domestic production and a redirection of state spending. The message behind the figure was simple. Growth without dependency is slower, but it lasts. Another number marked the change in income distribution. Salaries of senior officials and parliament members were cut 30%, while civil servants received a 50% increase. Within 6 months, consumption in urban areas climbed nearly 2%, reflecting renewed confidence at the base of the pyramid. The figures were small compared to richer economies, yet the moral impact was immense. Proof that fairness, not austerity, could stimulate motion. Then came the data no economist expected. National debt repayment to local creditors, stagnant for years, reached completion on 92% of outstanding accounts. That single statistic meant more than balance sheet hygiene. It meant trust had returned to circulation. Small companies began hiring again. Tax compliance improved by 11% in one fiscal cycle. Stability, it seemed, could be built from the bottom upward. Agriculture, the country's backbone, delivered the most visible delta. Tractor distribution rose from 200 units to over 900 within 18 months. Average yield for key crops, maize and cotton, increased 18 to 22%. The significance of those percentages was not just food output, it was proof that dignity could be measured in harvests, not donations. In manufacturing, 2 new cotton processing plants and 1 tomato processing facility began operations. Employment in local processing jumped from 4,500 to nearly 7,000 workers. Each payslip carried an invisible statement: we can create value here. Foreign debt exposure, by contrast, declined. Burkina Faso rejected new IMF and World Bank loans, reducing external obligations from 49% to 38% of GDP. Economists called it reckless, citizens called it freedom. The arithmetic said something in between: risk traded for autonomy. Even symbolic gestures left measurable traces. The removal of colonial wigs in court seemed cultural, yet survey data showed 68% of respondents felt greater national pride within 6 months of the reform. Confidence is not a statistic, but sometimes it behaves like one, spreading through markets, classrooms, and even the tone of public debate. Behind every figure lies the same equation: honesty multiplied by example equals momentum. When a president lives on a captain's salary, when ministers surrender privileges, when farmers see their effort turned into product, the numbers follow. So the spreadsheets, normally cold, read differently here. They were not about perfection or miracles. They were about a country measuring its independence in billions, in harvests, in dignity. Even revolutions earned their skeptics. In cafes from Dakar to Paris, voices argued that Ibrahim Traoré's defiance was reckless, not righteous. Some said independence without resources is just isolation dressed as pride. Others warned that rejecting global lenders and foreign troops would drain the nation faster than colonialism ever did. Their logic was cold but not foolish. The first opposing view sounded pragmatic. Without international partners, no economy can survive. It was an argument built on decades of precedent. Africa borrowing to breed. Critics claimed that Burkina Faso would crumble without IMF safety nets, foreign bases, or Western investors. For them, sovereignty was a luxury the poor could not afford. But the results complicated that claim. Growth did not collapse. It accelerated modestly. Local industries reopened. Internal debt vanished. Citizens paid taxes willingly. The model was fragile, yes, but functioning, and built on local consent rather than foreign credit. The counterfactual never arrived. The second critic cut deeper. Traoré's populism will eat itself. They feared that rallying pride against the West might ignite nationalism that devours reason. Yet observers on the ground reported something quieter. Discipline, not frenzy. Public rallies carried slogans about work, not vengeance. Donations to the National Defense Fund were voluntary, transparent, audited publicly. If this was populism, it was the most accountable kind ever recorded. Still, the skeptics were not wrong to worry. Risks remain real: investor flight, diplomatic isolation, pressure from neighbors still tied to old systems. Even supporters admit that sovereignty cannot be sustained by emotion alone. It requires systems as strong as its slogans. And that is where both sides unexpectedly meet. The critics seek stability. The reformers seek dignity. Both are essential. A nation needs fuel as much as fire. When placed together on the same table, one hand holding caution, the other courage, the full picture emerges. A young leader attempting the impossible, neither saint nor fool, building a fragile equilibrium between hope and survival. It is not about who is right, it is about who is still trying. And then everything turned. The moment came quietly, hidden in a single cabinet meeting. Ibrahim Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would create its own sovereign development fund, financed not by foreign banks, but by its citizens. For a continent long told it was too poor to invest in itself, the idea was unthinkable. Yet that day, ministers signed their salaries away into the fund, live on national television. It was the midpoint nobody predicted. For decades, Africa's wealth had flowed outward. Aid, loans, promises, always returning smaller. Now money began to circulate inward. Bank queues formed, not for withdrawals, but for contributions. Housewives gave coins. Soldiers donated days of pay. Students sent text message transfers worth less than a meal. Each act whispered the same belief: we can build our own tomorrow. The shift was emotional before it was economic. Dignity became currency. Hope became infrastructure. From that day, the revolution no longer depended on speeches or slogans. It lived in numbers, in payslips, in fingerprints on deposit forms. What followed next proved that this awakening was not a gesture, it was a system. It began as a moral stand, but it ended at reshaping everyday life. The decisions made in Ouagadougou soon rippled through every layer of the nation, from the state to the street. For the state, the impact was immediate and heavy. Ministries accustomed to external funding suddenly had to operate within domestic limits. Bureaucrats learned the math of restraint: spend only what is earned. The treasurer, once dictated by loan schedules, became a mirror of local productivity. Yet the constraint bred creativity. Regional governors began sharing transport fleets, pooling logistics, and coordinating procurement. Centralization softened, efficiency hardened. In the process, a new doctrine emerged: sovereignty measured not by speeches, but by balanced books. For businesses, the short-term pain was undeniable. Imports slowed, credit lines vanished, and profit margins shrank. Yet within months, something unexpected appeared. Demands for local substitutes. Small manufacturing firms doubled their orders. Local processing plants for tomatoes, cotton, and gold reported a 30% surge in output. The domestic market, once suffocated by foreign competition, began breathing again. What foreign investors called risk looked from the ground like opportunity rediscovered. For ordinary citizens, the transformation was personal. The 50% salary raise for civil servants triggered a modest but real uplift in living standards. In cities, families replaced anxiety with purpose. In villages, farmers used tractors and seeds delivered under new programs. Markets filled again with local goods. Confidence replaced dependence. Parents told their children that the government finally listened, not with words, but with wages. The most common phrase heard on the radio was simple: we are no longer waiting. For the region and beyond, the shock was contagious. In neighboring Mali and Niger, citizens watched closely, comparing prices, policies, and pride. Some governments flirted with similar reforms, others condemned them. Western capitals issued carefully worded warnings about unsustainable paths. Yet, within African social networks, the phrase "the Burkinabe way" became a synonym for courage. Internationally, the narrative fractured. To critics, Traoré was a nationalist risking isolation. To admirers, he was Africa's long-awaited course correction. Either way, Burkina Faso had become the example that proved independence could still mean something tangible in the 21st century. And as the dust settled, the truth was plain. Sovereignty was expensive, but submission had cost more. What remained to be seen was whether this balance could last, whether the nation's new spine could hold under pressure, or whether global forces would once again bend it back into shape. The most likely future does not look glorious, but it looks real. If the current trajectory continues, Burkina Faso will enter a phase of measured turbulence, neither collapse nor miracle, a balance between exhaustion and endurance. Ibrahim Traoré's government will keep tightening control over expenditure while pushing local production forward. Growth will hover around modest single digits, but it will be self-generated. The world will not applaud, yet it will watch. This base scenario assumes that external pressure remains economic rather than military. Sanctions may resurface, and loans may remain frozen. Still, with local debt cleared and industries revived, the domestic market will cushion the blow. Inflation will rise seasonally, but food supply, strengthened by agricultural reforms, will prevent crisis. Over time, the state will evolve into a leaner machine, operating on discipline instead of dependency. The optimistic scenario unfolds only if regional alliances strengthen. If Mali, Niger and others adopt similar models, collective bargaining power will grow. Trade among these countries could expand 25 to 30%, creating a continental safety net. In that case, Burkina Faso becomes not an exception, but a precedent. The symbol turns into a system. Proof that African cooperation can substitute external oversight. The worst-case scenario remains the most feared: an external shock or coordinated financial blockade. Without backup credit or reserves, the economy could contract sharply. Private investment would freeze, inflation could double within a year. Political unrest might follow, fueled not by ideology, but by fatigue. The same pride that built the revolution could, under stress, fracture it. Yet across these possibilities, one constant survives. The national mindset has changed. Even if numbers fall, faith in self-sufficiency will not vanish overnight. The notion that Africa can stand without kneeling has taken root, and roots rarely die quickly. The wise approach, then, is neither blind optimism nor cold cynicism. It is alert endurance, a willingness to adapt while holding ground. Because the future, as Traoré himself often says, is not promised to the loudest voice, but to the most disciplined one. Now that the noise fades and the numbers settle, one question remains. What does all of this mean for you, the person listening, far from Ouagadougou, yet caught in the same global web of dependence and pride? If you are among those who read between headlines, who question how nations rise or fall, the story is not foreign to you. It speaks to the quiet instinct that refuses to trade dignity for convenience. You already understand that freedom, personal or political, always comes with a cost. But perhaps Ibrahim Traoré's experiment in Burkina Faso offers a reminder. The cost can also be shared. If you work within a system that feels too large to change, remember the teachers, farmers and clerks who chose participation over complaint. Their strength came not from wealth, but from unity. Watching them is a mirror, showing how ordinary people, when trusted, stop waiting for permission. If you belong to those indirectly affected, the markets, investors, or citizens of nearby nations, you are witnessing the outline of a new equation. Value measured in trust, not in loans. Adjusting to it may be uncomfortable, but it also reveals a chance to rediscover purpose beyond profit. And if you have ignored the story until now, thinking it doesn't touch you, consider this. Indifference is a currency too. One that powerful systems spend to keep the world predictable. No one is asked to take sides, only to stay awake. Because whether you lead a company, a classroom, or a household, the principle is the same. Change begins when people stop outsourcing their courage. Revolutions fade if they are not built into routines. Ibrahim Traoré knows this, and so do the citizens who now look to turn symbols into systems. The challenge is no longer to prove independence, but to organize it, to make every level of society accountable for its share of the promise. At the national level, leadership must stay disciplined. Budgets should continue reflecting earned income, not imagined aid. Clear metrics, debt ratio, local production growth and employment rates can act as the nation's compass. Each quarter, without new foreign loans, should be recorded not as scarcity, but as sovereignty maintained. For businesses and institutions, the next step is adaptation. Domestic producers can form cooperatives to strengthen supply chains that once depended on imports. Universities and training centers can pivot toward engineering, agriculture, and resource processing, sectors that anchor self-reliance. Success here can be measured not in profit margins, but in import reduction percentages. For citizens, the roadmap is both simple and demanding. Continue contributing to the national fund, monitor its use, and insist on transparency. Volunteer for community audits, track how each franc moves. Freedom without oversight becomes illusion. Shared vigilance turns it real. If expansion is possible, regional cooperation remains the multiplier. A joint development council with Mali and Niger could coordinate defense, trade, and infrastructure projects within a synchronized timeline. Progress could be tracked through shared agricultural output or cross-border energy distribution, measurable acts of collective sovereignty. The core message endures. Solutions are not slogans, and leadership is not a performance. Burkina Faso's survival now depends on making integrity procedural, because independence is not a flag you raise once, it is a schedule you keep every day. The image that began this story still lingers. A young captain standing before his people, refusing comfort, choosing consequence. Ibrahim Traoré never promised miracles, he promised honesty. And somehow, in a continent accustomed to betrayal, the promise was enough to move mountains. Think back to the first factories that reopened, the debts quietly repaid, the farmers watching tractors cross dusty fields like slow-moving hope. None of it was perfect. All of it was real. Burkina Faso's rebirth was not thunderous. It was the steady rhythm of small decisions made in daylight, from the first refusal of a handshake abroad to the shared contributions of ordinary citizens at home. A full circle has closed. What began as protest evolved into policy, and what sounded like pride became practice. The nation learned that freedom, stripped of rhetoric, looks like responsibility, and beyond the numbers, this is what remains, a generation that finally believes dignity is not inherited, it is earned. Burkina Faso stands at the edge of uncertainty, but for the first time it stands on its own feet, because true independence isn't granted by power, it is kept alive by those who choose to carry its weight together. If this story has moved you, pause for a moment before you scroll away. Every nation, every community carries its own version of this struggle to stay upright when the world tells it to kneel. Burkina Faso's journey under Ibrahim Traoré is only one reflection of that larger truth. Maybe what you felt here wasn't about politics at all. Maybe it was about something quieter. The belief that integrity still matters, that courage can still start small and spread. If you think others deserve to understand this story, let it travel. Share it not for attention, but for awareness. Let it reach those who have stopped believing that leadership can be honest or that unity can be voluntary. And if you have a thought, a disagreement, or simply a question, leave it open, because dialogue is the last bridge we must never burn. After all, stories like these don't belong to a single country. They belong to anyone who still believes that dignity, once awakened, must never go back to sleep.